What would you do if court officers physically slammed you to the ground, not knowing you were about to become their boss? This is the true story of Judge Adrienne Simpkins, a black woman who walked into a Detroit courtroom as a visitor and left as the person who would decide those officers' futures. Sometimes justice has a sense of irony so perfect you couldn't write it as fiction that it's a humid morning in July 2018 at the 36th District Court in Detroit, Michigan. Adrienne Simpkins, dressed in casual business attire, arrives 45 minutes early for a hearing. Not as an attorney, not as a defendant, but as a community observer. She'd been recently elected as a district judge but hadn't yet been sworn in, her official start date still 3 weeks away. She wanted to observe courtroom proceedings, to understand the system she'd soon be part of from a citizen's perspective. What happened next would become a viral moment that exposed uncomfortable truths about implicit bias, respect, and who we assume belongs in positions of power. As Adrienne entered through the public entrance, she noticed the metal detectors and the two court officers stationed there, Officer Brandon Mitchell and Officer Teresa Gonzalez, both veterans of courthouse security with over a decade of experience each. The line moved slowly, typical for a Monday morning when dozens of people had hearings scheduled. Adrienne placed her bag on the conveyor belt and walked through the detector. It beeped. Standard procedure meant stepping aside for a secondary screening with a handheld wand. But what should have been routine turned hostile in seconds. According to court transcripts and witness statements later obtained by the Detroit Free Press, Officer Mitchell immediately adopted an aggressive tone. "Step over here." Now, Adrienne complied, asking politely if she could retrieve her phone from the bin to check her calendar. "Don't reach for anything," Mitchell snapped, moving to block her. Adrienne, confused by the escalating tension, explained she was a recently elected judge wanting to observe proceedings. Mitchell's response dripped with disbelief and contempt. "Sure you are. And I'm the mayor. Stop lying and cooperate." Multiple witnesses reported that his hand moved to his baton, a clear intimidation tactic for a situation that required none. What happened next was captured on courthouse security cameras, footage that would later be reviewed by Internal Affairs and shared widely on social media. When Adrienne reached again for her phone to show identification proving her position, Officer Gonzalez grabbed her arm forcefully. Adrienne pulled back instinctively, and Mitchell interpreted this as resistance. Within seconds, both officers had Adrienne on the ground, her face pressed against the courthouse floor, her arm wrenched behind her back. Spectators gasped. A woman waiting for traffic court pulled out her phone and started recording. Adrienne, a 52-year-old woman with no criminal record, a law degree from the University of Michigan, and 26 years of legal experience, was being treated like a violent criminal for the crime of existing in a space where she wasn't expected. Here's what makes this story so devastating. Research from the Perception Institute shows that black women face a unique intersection of racial and gender bias, often perceived as angrier, more aggressive, and less credible than white women or black men in the same circumstances. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that participants consistently rated black women as more threatening even when displaying identical behavior to white women. Adrienne Simpkins became a living case study of these statistics, manhandled by officers who couldn't conceive that a black woman in casual clothes could hold judicial authority. The commotion drew the attention of Judge Margaret Williams, a white woman in her 60s who'd been presiding in the building for 15 years. Williams emerged from her chambers, took one look at the scene, and immediately recognized Adrienne from the recent election coverage. "Release her immediately," Williams commanded, her voice sharp with authority. "That's Judge-elect Simpkins." The color drained from both officers' faces. Mitchell's grip loosened. Gonzalez stepped back as if burned. Adrienne rose slowly from the ground, her blazer torn, her dignity assaulted, and her faith in the system she'd dedicated her life to fundamentally shaken. The aftermath was swift and public. Judge Williams insisted on an immediate meeting with the court administrator, bringing Adrienne with her despite Adrienne's desire to simply leave and process what had happened. "If we don't document this now, it gets buried," Williams told her, and she was right. The incident report filed that day noted the officers' failure to follow de-escalation protocols, their refusal to examine offered identification, and their use of force on an individual who'd committed no crime and posed no threat. Within 72 hours, local news picked up the story. Within a week, it was national news. Within 2 weeks, it was an international conversation about implicit bias in the justice system. But here's where the story gets even more complex. 3 weeks later, on August 6, 2018, Adrienne Simpkins was officially sworn in as a district judge for the 36th District Court, the same building where she'd been assaulted. Her first day on the bench, she walked through those same metal detectors. Officer Mitchell and Officer Gonzalez were conspicuously absent, placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Other officers who'd witnessed the incident stood noticeably straighter, spoke more respectfully, and seemed hyper-aware of every interaction. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and everyone felt it'd in her first month. Adrienne presided over dozens of cases, including several that involved the very officers who'd manhandled her. Not Mitchell and Gonzalez directly, but their colleagues testifying in various proceedings. Court observers noted that she treated every officer with scrupulous fairness, never allowing her personal experience to color her judicial decisions. But there was an unspoken tension in the courtroom, an awareness that the woman in the judge's chair had intimate knowledge of how quickly respect could be withdrawn and force employed against those deemed unworthy of dignity. The disciplinary hearing for officers Mitchell and Gonzalez took place 4 months later, presided over by a different judge to avoid any appearance of bias. Adrienne testified, describing the incident without emotion but with precise legal detail. She noted every procedural violation, every moment where de-escalation could have occurred but didn't. The officers' defense relied heavily on claiming they'd felt threatened, but security footage contradicted their narrative at every turn. The hearing officer's conclusion was damning. Both officers had allowed racial bias and assumptions about authority to override their training. Mitchell received a 30-day suspension without pay and mandatory bias training. Gonzalez received a written reprimand and the same training requirement. Many activists argued these consequences were far too lenient, that similar behavior toward a judge would normally result in termination. Adrienne's response to the verdict surprised many. In a statement, she wrote, "I don't want these officers fired. I want them educated. I want them to understand that every person who walks through those doors deserves respect regardless of how they look or what assumptions you make about them. I want them to know that the young black mother coming in for a traffic ticket might be a doctor. The elderly Latino man with dirt under his fingernails might be a landowner. The woman you just slammed to the ground might be your next judge." Her focus wasn't on revenge, but on systemic change, a position that drew both praise for its grace and criticism from those who felt she was being too forgiving of inexcusable behavior. The incident catalyzed significant changes in the 36th District Court. Chief Judge Nancy Blunt, who'd been horrified by the incident, implemented mandatory quarterly bias training for all court staff, not just security officers. She established a civilian oversight committee to review complaints about court officer conduct. She created a protocol requiring officers to accept and examine any form of identification offered by individuals before escalating to physical intervention. These changes, while not revolutionary, represented acknowledgement that the system had failed and needed correction, but the broader impact extended far beyond one courthouse. Adrienne began speaking at law schools, police academies, and judicial conferences about her experience. She framed it not as a personal grievance, but as an educational opportunity. "I had the credentials, the election results, and the legal standing to fight back," she told an audience at Howard University Law School. "But what about the people who don't? What about the single mother who gets treated this way and has no recourse? My story went viral because of the irony, because I became their judge. But countless stories never get told because the victims don't have institutional power." Statistics support her concern. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, Black Americans are significantly more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, and subjected to force by law enforcement and court officers, even when controlling for offense severity and criminal history. A 2020 report by the National Center for State Courts found that implicit bias training, while imperfect, did reduce discriminatory treatment in court settings when implemented comprehensively and reinforced regularly. Adrienne's case became a teaching tool in these trainings, a real-world example of how quickly bias can escalate into violence. 5 years later, in 2023, Judge Adrienne Simpkins sat for an interview, reflecting on the incident and its aftermath. She'd become one of Detroit's most respected jurists, known for her fairness, her thoughtful rulings, and her commitment to treating every person in her courtroom with dignity. When asked if she'd forgiven officers Mitchell and Gonzalez, she paused before answering. Forgiveness isn't really the right word. I've moved past anger. I've chosen not to let that moment define me. But I also haven't forgotten, because forgetting would dishonor everyone else who experiences this without cameras, without witnesses, without the power I eventually held. Officer Mitchell, who completed his suspension and bias training, eventually left courthouse security to work in private security. In a rare interview, he admitted the incident had fundamentally changed his approach to his work. I made assumptions based on race, based on clothing, based on what I thought authority looked like, he said. I'm not proud of it, but I can't undo it. All I can do is make sure I never treat another person that way again. Officer Gonzalez remained with courthouse security, reportedly becoming an advocate for better training protocols. What's the lesson from Judge Adrienne Simpkins' story? It's not just about the poetic justice of victims becoming judges, though that irony is powerful. It's about how deeply embedded our assumptions are about who belongs in positions of power, about who deserves respect, about whose word we automatically trust. It's about the fact that a Black woman with a law degree, an election victory, and decades of legal experience could still be slammed to the ground because she didn't match someone's mental image of what a judge looks like. And it's about choosing to transform trauma into systemic change rather than simply seeking personal vindication. If this story made you think differently about bias, respect, and justice, hit that like button and drop a comment sharing your perspective. Subscribe for more true stories that challenge how we see the world and each other. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come from moments when the universe delivers perfect, uncomfortable irony. And sometimes, the woman on the ground becomes the woman in the judge's chair, and everyone learns what respect should have looked like from the start.